Hello everybody and welcome to week 6 of Essential Sciences for Person-Centred Care. Today we are going to be looking at cytology and histology, which collectively means the study of cells and study of tissues. And specifically within that we'll be looking at the cellular and tissue levels of organisation. Last week we explored the different levels of organisation and we did a task that looked at those different levels, ultimately how smaller structures can combine together to become larger structures all the way through from the chemical, cellular, tissue, organ system and organismal levels of organisation. And today we're looking specifically at two of those levels, specifically the cellular level and tissue level. So the main outcomes for today is to explain the structure and function of a cell, as well as the main types of tissues within the body. And by collectively doing that, we should start to gain a good understanding of the cellular and tissue levels of organisation. As you can see, we are currently on week 6, so today is the 15th of October 2020. We've got one more week before October vacation, and next week we'll be looking at the organ level of organisation. And as you can see, the schedule takes us all the way up to winter vacation after October half term, and what we're doing week on, week out. So last week, as a recap, we looked at the different types of anatomy and the fields and studies of anatomy, so we could gain a real understanding of why we actually study it within Essential Sciences for Person-Centred Care. So as a recap, for those that wasn't there last week, for example, or for those that are maybe not understanding the topics, anatomy basically means cutting up. The best thing that you can do with anatomy and physiology and the terms that come with this study is they have root words, and those root words are broken down into either Greek or Latin. So if we break down anatomy, ana means up, toma means cutting. Ultimately, the study of anatomy is through cutting up things, and that's how the term derived. In our sense, it's a scientific study of body structures, which is, in its anatomical terms, called morphology, and development. As we know, we start from two sets of single cells, an egg cell and a sperm cell, and collectively they combine to make larger tissues and structures, which ultimately creates a baby. And as we get older, cells become larger and larger. Ultimately, that's why we look at development as well. The founding father of anatomy, or one of the founding people of anatomy, was someone called Andreas Vesalius, who was a Belgian physician, and he was coined the father of anatomy. And he created some of the published works, one of which are the most notable is what's called the human eye corpus fabrica, which basically means the fabric of the human body. And he basically dissected human bodies, one of which is the picture just to the right of the text. And ultimately, he used to get bodies, so people would find bodies for him. Hopefully they were dead bodies, people that have deceased, and they ultimately studied them. But it came a time and a point where Andreas Vesalius was very notable in his field, and had a high supply, or needed a high supply of cadavers, dead bodies essentially speaking. And people, or it was theorised that people are actually going out and killing people purely for the study of anatomy, so murdering people just so that doctors could ultimately examine them. The doctors didn't know that, or maybe they turned a blind eye to that. And it was only until the Anatomy Act in 1832 and revised in 1984, which actually ensured that there were a licence behind examining bodies. So it gave a licence to doctors, teachers of anatomy, and bona fide medical students to dissect bodies that were donated. And it was enacted in response to the public revulsion, ultimately, in the illegal trade of corpses. One of which, that the illegal trade in corpses, is someone called Burke and Hare. Ultimately, there were people called body snatchers. These were them to start with. And they did ultimately secretly remove corpses from burial sites. And ultimately, this trade didn't, in their eyes, wasn't very entrepreneurial. They weren't making a lot of money. So the way that they did it was killed people and donated them. which is very graphic and something that's not accepted now, and obviously that's why we have the Anatomy Act in place to ensure it's regulated. No matter where you are in the world, the anatomical language, so the femur for example, would be the exact same term and definition in any single country that you would go to. And the reason why it does that is, well, the International Congress of Anatomists define what anatomical language actually is. So if you went to speak to a doctor in Iran or America or Australia, or non-native English speakers such as Brazil, Peru, they would all speak the same anatomical language, which ensures that everybody knows and understands the same information. The opposite end of anatomy is physiology, and physiology ultimately is the study of physical function and ultimately how the body works, and that includes biochemical processes. So last week we looked at what is this chemical formula, and that chemical formula actually signifies glucose. In other words, physiology just doesn't look at body functions and how things function at a basic level. It also looks at chemistry and physics and not just biology. And there's subdisciplines for exercise, for physiology, which include exercise physiology, which is the study of how the body functions as a result of exercise, pathophysiology as a result of disease, and neurophysiology, which is ultimately exploring the brain's function and how that works. So just like the subtypes of anatomy, of physiology, there is subtypes of anatomy. We've got gross anatomy, which is the study of the human body at the visible or microscopic level. And this way of teaching gross anatomy or learning gross anatomy is through cadaveric dissection, very similar to the founding father Andreas Vesalius. We've also got surface anatomy, and this looks at organs at a topographical level through ultimately touching or feeling structures. The anatomical or the medical term is called palpating. So we looked at the different anatomical landmarks, such as the sternal angle of Lewis and the spinous processes, and how they can be used ultimately as points of reference. So by locating the sternal angle of Lewis, you would be able to identify the top part of your heart from the anterior side of the body, and also the spinous process of the 7th vertebrae locates the near top location part of the heart. If you can locate the spinous process of the 7th vertical vertebrae, which might be a task for you if you haven't done it before, maybe try and Google how to locate it. Essentially speaking, it's the most lumpiest part of your spine at the top of your neck. If you try and locate 2 discs below, which I believe takes you to a T8, so your 8th thoracic vertebrae, that then is the top part of your heart in terms of location. So surface anatomy looks at locations at a localised level through touching or feeling. For example, performing a physical examination. Regional anatomy looks at structures of the human body by regions or divisions, and the main regions that are studied in anatomy are head and neck, thorax, abdomen and pelvis, and then through the appendicular skeleton, the upper and lower extremities. This can be refined even further by organ. So for example, when we look at what health professionals may need to study specific regions of anatomy, you could, for example, theorise that dentists need to look at head and neck. You could look at cardiac surgeons, purely look at the heart, so heart surgeons. If you're looking to become a midwife, for example, or someone that might specialise in gynecology, you might look at pelvic and lower anatomy, specific to a gender as well, so male or female. In that case, to become a midwife, it would be female anatomy. Can you think of any others? So maybe explore what type of profession are you wanting to move into, and what types of regional anatomy might you want to specifically focus on. And when we start looking at organs next week, this is when we'll start to be combining this kind of concept. We've also got radiological anatomy, which basically is the study of the human body through medical image and scanning. And last week we looked at the different types, of which there is X-rays, angiograms and CT scans, all of which use X-ray radiation. We've got MRI scans, which uses magnets, called magnetic resonance imaging. And we've also got ultrasound, what's called sonography. Ultimately, there is different levels of safety, and ultimately different reasons why different types of medical imaging may be used. For example, MRI scans uses magnets, so if anything is magnetic, for example metal in your body, generally speaking that wouldn't be a safe type of medical imaging to perform. Equally, if you are doing X-rays on a child or an embryo or an unborn baby, would X-rays be a safe and effective way? Well, no, it wouldn't. Giving radiation in high doses to a child or an unborn baby could give it serious side effects. So in that case, you'd use ultrasound, and ultrasound as a whole is the safest way of studying the human body, ultimately through medical imaging or scanning. So the first image is what's called an angiogram. Angiogram is a form of an X-ray that looks specifically at the flow of blood vessels. Blood vessels don't show up on an X-ray, so what you have to do is put an iodine-based solution in the blood, and ultimately through the iodine it shows ultimately the blood vessels and the flow. Here we've got another form of a scan, and ultimately which leads on to the ultrasound scan, which ultimately is most likely and most commonly shown when you are looking at babies due to be born. When we look at anatomical terminology, we look at what's called the anatomic position, what is otherwise known as a reference position, and we need to understand when we're looking at studying anatomy and physiology why we need this basic reference position. This basic reference position is illustrated in the image to the right, which is the body erect with arms at the sides and palms turned forward. We need this reference position as we need to be able to understand different positions, different regions. And if everyone positioned in a different way when we're looking at anatomy and physiology, it will become very arduous and very, very complex to understand. So to make it basic, we use this reference position. And there's different types of anatomical terminology that I can have a look at, and take a look at week 5's information. It'll give you a lot of information on what we mean by those. So this week we are looking at both cytology and histology. So cytology ultimately is the study of cells. When we break down the root terms of cytology, we have got cyto or site and then ology. Site or cyto means cells, and ology means the study of. Combine those together, the study of cells. Ultimately, cytology, or the study of cells, was explored and researched in the mid-1800s by Matthias Schleiden, Theodor Schwann and Rudolf Virchow. And they all agreed that plants, animals and humans are all made up of cells and also start off as a single cell. So one ultimately was a scientist that explored plants, one looked at animals, a zoologist, and one ultimately was a medical doctor. And collectively they all got together and theorised, well, if animals and plants and humans all have cells, they can then suggest that all living things are made of a cell, a single cell, and are made up of multiple cells as such. A cell is defined as the smallest, most basic unit of life that can maintain, basically survive, and perpetuate, which means replicate itself. Cells can only grow so large before they either have to stop growing or divide. And basically that's because the cell's metabolism can't keep up with uptaking nutrients and moving waste products. A basic example of this is us as humans at the age of around 21. we stop growing. If we carried on growing, our metabolisms wouldn't be able to keep up with nutrient uptake and also removing waste products, and also wouldn't be effective in terms of environment. So we stopped growing at 21. Obviously humans are around anything between maybe 4 to 6 foot in height, maybe even taller. Cells can only gain a certain size. What they've got in each cell is different cellular processes, and some of the ones that I'm going to discuss with you is cellular respiration, protein synthesis, DNA and RNA and what those actually mean, as well as water. So to start with, for cellular respiration, all cells need glucose and oxygen to form a process called cellular respiration, what you might have heard of in biology, or if you look at it in exercise physiology, aerobic respiration. And this creates the body's most basic form of energy through a process what's called the Krebs cycle. Ultimately, where oxygen and glucose are broken down to create our body's most basic form of energy. And that most basic form of energy is something called adenosine triphosphate. That is ultimately the fuel for the human body, just as what petrol would be for a car. And ultimately, a byproduct of aerobic respiration is carbon dioxide. So you could suggest that's why we eat carbohydrates to get glucose and why we breathe in for oxygen. Ultimately, it's for this most basic form of respiration called cellular respiration. And a byproduct of that is carbon dioxide, which eventually, through the kind of like last processes, we breathe that out of the body. We've also got protein synthesis, and these are ultimately, our proteins are made by amino acids. Amino acids are typically referred to as the building blocks of life. Ultimately, cells need more proteins to become larger or maintain the size, and protein synthesis enables that. Cells also, as part of creating proteins, they can also break down proteins as well. And a byproduct of breaking down proteins is what's called ammonia and urea, and that, essentially speaking, needs to be removed from the cell. Larger bodily processes, so tissues, organs and body systems, remove that waste. We have all got something called DNA and RNA, and DNA is defined as deoxyribose nucleic acid, and RNA essentially is ribonucleic acid. Ultimately, all cells need what's called nucleotides, and these basically form genes. So you might have heard of terms called adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, and these are ultimately the main building blocks of our DNA and RNA. And ultimately, they form chromosomes. And a byproduct of creating DNA and RNA is something called uric acid. And again, our body needs to remove that, so the cell needs to remove it from the cell, and ultimately then the tissues, body systems ultimately need to remove it from the body. Within the body there is approximately 1 trillion cells, so all these bodily processes are happening just as we're speaking now in all of us bodies. So in summary, cells can only grow so big. After that they have to remain the same size or divide into 2 smaller cells. If they do divide into 2 smaller cells, or ultimately more than 2 cells, cells combine together to form a larger structure, and that becomes a tissue, and something that we'll be looking at shortly. So there are different types of cells, so not all cells are human, whether they're plant-based, animal-based, they can be non-human based. So human cells are what's called eukaryotic cells, and these cells have a nucleus and what's called many complex organelles. L's means small, organs means what we define as an organ, something that works and is a larger structure. And they include animal, plant and fungal cells. So for example, animals, humans, plants, look at plants in your back garden, fungal cells, simplest way to call it is like mushrooms. And then we've got prokaryotic cells, and these include bacteria, and they lack a nucleus. So if you have a look at these pictures here, two very distinctly but equally complex cells that are living and obviously inhabit Earth as such. So what different types of human cells do you know of? Obviously the picture to the right gives you a little bit maybe of an example. Ultimately, there are many different types of human cells, and they all start off from what's called a stem cell, a specialised human cell that are able to develop into many different specialised cells at different stages of life. For example, we've got embryonic stem cells and adult stem cells. Embryonic stem cells have the ability to specialise into many different types of cells. For example, the ones that are categorised below. But ultimately, throughout life, those, or the ability of stem cells to produce different types of cells for the human body for an adult becomes less and less. And ultimately, stem cell research is trying to bridge those gaps. So how can we ultimately improve life expectancy? And stem cell research or diseases is the main foundation of that. But in terms of the different types of cells that we'll look at, we're going to look at a cell generally, but we're going to look quite closely at epithelial, connective, nervous and muscle cells as they start to become larger structures and build into tissues. So the most outer part of a cell is what's called the plasma membrane, and this provides a boundary or a skin, if you were comparing it to us as a human at an organismal level, for the cell. This plasma membrane is what's called selectively permeable, or even selectively semi-permeable. And what that basically means, it allows some substances to enter and some substances to leave. So you could call this something very similar to like passport control at an airport or a boat port. It only lets certain things in and it only lets certain things out. When we start to look at things like viruses and bacteria and how they can ultimately impact cells at a cellular level, viruses can ultimately overcome this selectively semi-permeable membrane, ultimately to try and replicate a substance that's entering the body, and it lets it in, and ultimately that can cause infections. Inside the cell, we've got then something called cytoplasm. A cell is roughly 80% water and 20% proteins, and cytoplasm is a semi-fluid substance that contains cytosol and organelles. Cytosol being the liquid that fills the interior of a cell, what is called intracellular liquid or fluid, and suspended in that fluid is what's called organelles, mini organs, you could call those, through using the prefix aspect of it, breaking down that term. And these are structures within a cell that form a specific function to keep a cell alive. So if we look at an organ system or at an organismal level of how we need the brain, the heart, the liver, the stomach to survive at an organismal level, we've got many organs within a cell that keeps the structure alive and ultimately maintains key functions. And the nucleus controls the functions of the cell. For example, it causes proteins to be created and cellular division ultimately causes the cell to divide. And this, for example, if you wanted to compare it to a key structure at an organismal level, would be something like the brain. So we've got organelles, different structures that keep the cell alive, and within the body there are several different types. For example, nucleus, ribosomes, endoplasmic reticulum, there's two types of those, rough and smooth, Golgi body, mitochondria, lysosomes, and many, many more. Just as if there's many different types of organs within this body, there's hundreds. There's lots of different organelles within a cell. And I'll be finding a task later which will explore the functions of these. Moving on to histology, which is the study of living tissues. Essentially speaking, cells combine together to make a larger structure, and when this happens, we can then define it as something called tissue or living tissue. And these tissues are groups of similar cells that will have a similar structure and work together to perform a larger function. And the main types of tissues that we're looking at is epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue, and connective tissue. And structures that we can see through a microscope can be identified just to the right of image. So ultimately, that's what some examples of tissues look like. So the main tissues that we're going to be looking at are those, and these contribute to homeostasis, so the body staying alive and working as it should do by providing a diverse range of functions, including and not limited to protection, support, movement, communication, and resistance to disease. And we're going to look at these more closely. So what I want you all to do is to locate the following resources on Google Classroom. First, I want you to locate the worksheet titled The Cellular and Tissue Level Organisation in the Human Body. Go on to literature and find two different forms of literature titled The Cellular Level and Tissue Levels of Organisation in the Human Body. And what I want you to do is describe at least 3 key structures within a cell, the functions, and also locate an image so that you can identify it for future. I want you to then explain the 4 primary types of tissue in the human body and the functions. And ultimately, when you've done that, is try and have a look. This isn't mandatory, this by all means, but have a look at citing and referencing the sources according to the APA system of referencing. If you go on Sheffield Hallam's website, some information might be on there. It's not mandatory, by all means, don't worry about it if you're not wanting to do that. And before you submit it, just double check that your work's free of any spelling, punctuation and grammar errors. And that's everything for today, essentially speaking. So next week we'll be looking at the organ system level of organisation. But for now, and today's task leading up to the end of today's session is to explain the structure and function of a cell as well as the main types of tissues through this task. If you've got any questions, then there'll be Google Meet, a live video call for you to answer any questions that you might have got. Equally, Google Hangouts as well if you're wanting to ask questions through messages. But that's everything for today. Crack on with this worksheet and hand into Google Classroom when you've done it. And that's everything.